Hi there. Good evening to all of you and welcome to this time and space to learn together. Um, we're working back there on a technological issue, but we're going to proceed. Thanks for coming this evening. My name is John Wachter. I'm a member of this congregation, member of the Mission Committee, and also a member of the Racial Justice Working Group, which is a team out of that group helped to put this Lenten series together. And I wanted to say that these sessions are being recorded. You can also participate by Zoom if you can't make it here in person. But if you can't make it in person or Zoom, then you will be able to see a presentation on the church's website. There's a tab that's an events tab, and under that you will see Wednesday Night Connection, and under that you will see adults educational opportunities, I think it says. And if you click on that, you will see these series of presentations listed, and week by week we'll be posting a YouTube of the presentation. The first one is now posted, the second one not quite yet, I don't think, but they'll eventually all be posted. If you miss one,
my name with your picture.
As I said, this series was planned by the Racial Justice Working Group, and I'd like to thank in particular from that group the organizers Gail Lanfear, Nancy Schulte, Barbara Morrison, Rachel Starkenberg, and tonight's speaker, Lucy Wachter-Webb. And that group, the working group, established as one of its priorities in 2022 the following statement: reckon with the missional and colonial history of this land, specifically Presbyterian's role, and work to build a relationship with the Native American community. At this time of Lent, we hope to begin that effort in earnest with this series, to reckon with the past, and do that in part through learning in this series, which is entitled Place, the Land, the Church, and the People Where We Live. So week one, we had Tom Deluge from the Doherty House as our speaker. And week two was Mark Wilson, Tribal Vice Chair of and also City Commissioner, Tribal Vice Chair of the Tribal Council for the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa Chippewa Indians. And this week we have Reverend Lucy Wachter-Webb, local faith leader, who will be talking about the Doctrine of Discovery. Week four is not next Wednesday, but we skip a Wednesday because of spring break. And April 6th, it will be Eric Hemingway. And he is the director of the Department of Repatriation, Archives, and Records of the Little Traverse Bay Band of Ottawa Indians. And he will speak specifically on the boarding schools that were run for Native Americans in this region. So I think many of you have heard this already before, but my job is to repeat it every week, so maybe you'll hear it at some point in time. Part of reckoning with any history is to examine past events in the context of who wrote the history. In the introductory text for the Our Peoples Museum exhibit at the Smithsonian Institution's Museum for the American Indian in Washington, D.C., the curators made a clear distinction between the past and history. And what they wrote was, the past never changes, but the way we understand it, learn about it, changes all the time. Part of what we have to recognize is it's not the goal of this series to pit histories against one another, but we need to recognize that who writes the history is affected by power. And people who hold the power often use it to shape the history for their own purposes. The Our Peoples exhibit at the Smithsonian was done in collaboration with Native tribal communities, and it presents a different version of American history than many of us probably encountered in our lives, and that the popular narratives of defeat and disappearance for Native Americans are not the tale they chronicle. They chronicle instead the most remarkable story of human survival and human history, is what that museum documents. George Erasmus, a respected Aboriginal leader from Canada, said, "Where common memory is lacking, where people do not share the same past or history, there can be no real community." In that spirit, at this time of Lent, we pray that the series may be confessional in nature. This is because we recognize that racism at its very root is a spiritual problem. We hope to reckon with the histories that have been told, the histories that have not been told, and the role of our own church's power in the mix between those two. Those of you who have been here before have heard the first 2 weeks. I think this week will be somewhat more challenging, and next week challenging, even more challenging after that. But we think we designed it that way. Stick with us. We believe you will be blessed and hopefully inspired to action. And I'm going to add something this week, which hope I don't steal too much time. There will be an opportunity for action in this congregation coming up. There will be 2 Sundays, April 24th and May 1st. Will be presentations that will be entitled "Together We Are Stronger." Let's talk about how policy is done in PCUSA, specifically the upcoming 225th General Assembly of this church, and some of the ovations that will be presented for racial, gender justice and the environment. And there will be opportunities for action around those. There's one ovation specifically that's asking for action around missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. It's a situation where much of it isn't even documented. There's no coordination between legal authorities, and it's a disgrace. And our church, through this ovation, is calling for action in that regard. So please join us for those opportunities on April 24th and May 1st after worship. Those are some clear action opportunities. If you're not a member of the Racial Justice Working Group, there's a sign-up sheet in back. If you'd like to be, please put your contact information down there. Everyone is welcome. Thank you for the blessing of your presence here this evening. And I'd like to have Rachel come forward. She's going to offer the land acknowledgement this evening.
This is a land acknowledgement written by Reverend Webb. As we gather tonight, sitting on this particular patch of land, we remember the land has a history, a present, and a future. Long ago, before any brick laid or concrete poured, there was likely a tree standing right where each of our feet rest now. Here, it was likely a white pine, a red pine, or a hemlock. This land was covered with the forest, which was home to much life before the trees were clear cut in just a short span of a few decades. The trees here were called green gold by the lumber barons. As the trees came down at the hands of the white communities who settled on the land, the people native to this place had their land stolen and experienced ethnic cleansing and genocide. Tonight, we gather on the ancestral lands and the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe peoples. This land was stolen by a people who thought ownership of the sacred earth was theirs to take. In 1839, Peter Dougherty, a Presbyterian minister, was sent to the area by the Presbyterian Board of Foreign Mission to establish a church and a school here. It was the establishment of this mission, alongside the development of white settler communities in the area, that in part grew the wealth for this church. Our land access, this building, the endowment, and our power locally all grow out of this history. at the expense of Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous life. And as a Presbyterian, I acknowledge and confess the harms of my spiritual ancestors for the violence that occurred in the name of our spiritual tradition, as the first Christian mission in the region where I reside. Many of these truths about the past we are still learning and recovering. We offer deep gratitude and respect for the elders past and present of the Three Fires Confederacy, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and the Potawatomi peoples who call Turtle Island home. We give thanks for their stewardship of the land, for protecting the water, for remembering we are all part of this great home we also call Earth. We offer our gratitude today for the ways they continue to lead us toward right relationship with the earth and with each other. And we give thanks for the ways they continue to lead us toward collective liberation.
And so as we begin this gathering this evening, we take a moment to ground ourselves in this place and time. So I invite you all, if you haven't taken a deep, full breath today, to do so. A deep breath in, and then let it go. And settle yourself. And before we come into the grounding practice, just take a look around you. So you might be familiar with this space, or you may not. So look to the right and to the left, behind you and in front of you, so that you can fully ground yourself in this place. And then I invite you to settle back into your chair, and if your back is not touching the back of your chair, maybe that's helpful, and to both root down through your sits bones and to rise up through the crown of your head. So you are sitting tall but not tense, straight but not stiff. And then if it feels right, I invite you to close your eyes. And if that doesn't feel comfortable, you can simply lower the gaze and have your eyes just lose their focus. So imagine the light around the edges softening. The gaze is down or the eyes are closed. And then notice as the eyes close, the other senses may become more acute. The sense of hearing, letting yourself become aware of the sounds in the room around you, letting your awareness move from sound to sound. And then letting that awareness simply just move to the edges. And so those sounds inside the room or outside the room become an encircling wall of protection around this place, so that you are aware of sound but not listening to it. You may notice the sensations in the body, the touch of the clothing on the skin, and the feel of your body in the chair. Allow yourself to settle and soften and feel the weight and shape of you. Noticing how the breath comes in and the breath goes out. Maybe noticing the temperature of the air, places of coolness, places of warmth. And that as we begin this gathering, bring your awareness to the center of your heart. The heart space in the chest, both in front of the chest and move back. Maybe the place where your wings would be, settle that place down. Shoulders drop away from the ears. so that the center of you is open, receptive, ready. Take a deep breath right into the center of that space, and then letting it go. Acknowledging that there is more here than words can express. That there is more here than the body can feel. But all of it is connected. All of it can be given space and time and compassion. And as you breathe in and out, let that awareness of your heart space expand, maybe even beyond the skin, out the front, from the back view to the sides, to the place above, to the ground, connecting with all that is here. People in the room, space, light in the room, and then the spaces beyond this room. The water, the trees, the sky, and the earth. And the people outside this room, past and present, and those who are to come. Take a deep breath into all that you are and all that is. And then let that go in a soft sigh. Very gently, let the chin come down to the chest, giving the back of the neck a good stretch. Bring your awareness back into your body, your feet on the floor, your seat in the chair, the warmth or coolness of your hands, the pulses and the palms. And as you are ready, you can let the eyes open, but keep the gaze down. And let soft vision around the edges come in first. And then as you are ready, you can lift your gaze and come back into this place.
Yes, me again. Hard to follow that act. This evening, I do have the privilege and the honor to introduce our speaker today, the Reverend Lucy Webb. Yesterday, I spoke to one of my former colleagues. I had noticed a death notice in the Traverse Ticker, who was one of our past coworkers. So I called my friend and told him about that. But during our conversation, he shared with me that his wife had heard my daughter Lucy speak at a rally, local rally recently, and he said she came home and described her as a mover and a shaker. So it's with that blessing that I received yesterday that I offer some more information about Lucy. She describes herself as a politicized faith leader and organizer, a healer, writer, and ritualist, working at the intersections of spirit, body, and anti-oppression to support the emergence of our collective liberation. She believes the work of engaging our spiritual life is not so very different from engaging in our shared public or political life. After 10 years as a pastor with congregations in Columbus, Ohio and Memphis, Tennessee, her ministry is now focused on engaging other radicalized white people in anti-racism practice. She is always deepening her own. At this point, I will add that if it weren't for Lucy's influence, I would likely not be involved in working for racial justice. Lucy is currently on staff with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and she's engaged in helping community organizing in this church and with the new local interfaith group called the Grand Traverse SALT Coalition, stands for Spiritual Activists Leading Together, and is also a part of a team of anti-racism facilitators with the organization Title Track. Lucy found her way towards anti-racism work through first studying implicit bias as a psychology major in college, and then working with people who have experienced incarceration for pastoral ministry and training with the Ann Braden program with the Catalyst Project. The reunion of her body began with yoga practice, and her embodiment practice has been further shaped by white racial justice somatics with Amanda Ream and Dara Silverman, the lineage of generative somatics and the Strozzi Institute, and by studying with Elisheva Wolf. By way of lineage, excuse me, second page. Somatic experiencing. Her children are some of her best teachers, as are the trees in her garden. Please help me in welcoming my daughter, Lucy.
Catch up here. I greet you tonight with a half voice. And so we're gonna see how long it lasts. And I'll be with you until it goes away. And then if it goes away quickly, I will invite some conversation among ourselves in the room. It's really good to be with you tonight. I know many of you already, as I've been with this church now for a couple of years in relationship and conversation and organizing. And it's really special to be here tonight in this particular way. I do want to just make one quick correction on the bio, which was just a misread, I think. He said I'm here to gather in radicalized white folks. And I want to just offer a correction that it's actually racialized white folks. We've been racialized to be white, most of us in this room. I do hope to radicalize you a little bit in the process. So, but just to clarify. Let me pull up my notes here to get us started. I actually had planned to show a video tonight as a portion of our time together, and I was going to show a shorter portion of that, and I'm actually going to rely on it to help me do what I like to do tonight and show you the full 17 minutes so that I can do some other things with my voice. So I'm going to briefly introduce where we're going tonight, and then we're actually going to settle in and watch a YouTube video together that's about 17 minutes long, and then I'll come back and summarize it, pull a few more threads in what Mark Charles has to share for us. So tonight is about the Doctrine of Discovery, right? You knew that much coming in. Who's heard of it before? Yeah? Almost everyone. It's okay if you haven't. In 1 or 2 or 3 words, if you have a phrase or a key notion of what the Doctrine of Discovery is, or what you learned it to be in school, if you actually learned about it in school, what words or phrases come to mind? Or it might be like, I don't know, I just know it exists. Yeah. Racial hubris. Okay, yeah. Anything else? Finders keepers. Presumed superiority. If we discovered your yard, it's ours. Yeah. Anything else? By the will of God. Yeah. These are great. See, y'all know, I don't even need to do more tonight. You already know the gist of it. So at its basic, essential sort of definition of what it is a religious declaration that eventually got codified into a secular law in the United States court system. So it began with papal bulls, which are a public decree by the Pope, and it developed across both Catholic and Protestant religious traditions over time. It supported colonial expansion projects over several centuries, and it eventually landed in the US courts where the phrase Doctrine of Discovery was first articulated in 1823 and became a legal precedent that is still utilized today, very recently. So it's religious at its root, but it's actually a sort of secular doctrine or legal concept. It can be confusing because when we use the word doctrine, we think that is a declaration that says something about God, right? Religious doctrine says something about what we believe about God, but this doctrine doesn't actually do that. It's, the phrase as it evolved over time was really legal precedent that said nothing theological, but we want to be careful not to separate it from the religious roots, which led to that legal precedent. I'm going to just transition, I think, to Mark Charles at this point, who's going to walk you through that process and save my voice for a few other things, hopefully. So what I hope to do today, before we're done, is to trace the history and the development of the Doctrine of Discovery and how it is connected to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the missional expansion of Christianity, including the Presbyterian tradition. And to understand the ways in which all those documents and all that colonial expansion are interconnected in the violence that we've been speaking about in this series. The violence upon indigenous people and the taking of indigenous lands. So Mark Charles has been studying this much longer than I. I'm like a armchair historian who's been learning about this as it relates to the anti-racism work that I have been a part of now for several years. And he does a much better job of walking through the historical documents. And I think it's powerful to hear an indigenous voice do that as well. So he is a speaker, writer, consultant. He's the son of an American woman of Dutch heritage and a Navajo man. And he teaches around the complexities of American history regarding race, culture, and Christendom. He's served on the boards, I think it's worth knowing, of the Christian Reformed Church of North America, not so distant relatives of the Presbyterian Church, and the Christian Community Development Association. And this is a video, you can go ahead and cue it up, of a TED Talk that he's done many times and has offered in Michigan at Calvin College, I know, and I think a few other places local to our area as well. So as I said, it's about 17 minutes long. I invite you to settle in and listen to what Mark has to offer us this evening, and I'll be back with more.
Yak A. Mark Charles Inishya. Sin Bakadan Nishla, the Tohiglini Bashichin. Sin Bakadan Bashiche, the Totichitni Bashanella. In the Navajo culture, when you introduce yourself, you always name your 4 clans. We're a matrilineal people, and our identities come from our mother's mother. Now, my mother's mother happens to be American of Dutch heritage, and so I say Sin Bakadan Nishla, which translated means I'm from the wooden shoe people. My second clan, my father's mother, is Tohiglini, which is the waters that flow together. My third clan, my mother's father, is also Tsinbake-Dinea. And my fourth clan, my father's father, is Totochitni, and that's the Bitterwater clan. It's one of the original clans of our Navajo people. Before I go any further, I want to first acknowledge that we are on the land of the Pamunkey, the Haudenosaunee, and the Piscataway. These are the tribes that lived here. They raised their families here, they hunted here, they fished here, they farmed here, they buried their ancestors here. These were the people who had society and life here long before Columbus got lost at sea. These were the tribes that were ethnically cleansed and removed from these lands so that the state of Virginia, the District of Columbia, and the state of Maryland could be founded. And I like to acknowledge the people whose land I'm standing on wherever I go around the country. First, just to honor them and to thank them for the years they've stewarded these lands. And second, to remind myself, to remind us to be more humble as we walk on these lands, acknowledging that there is a story that goes beyond the history that we've read and that we're taught in our schools. In his final State of the Union, President Obama was talking about the need in our nation for a new politics. And he said, "We the people." Our Constitution begins with these three simple words we've come to recognize mean all the people. Now, when I heard that, as a Native man, I had to stop and ask when. I've read our founding documents, I've studied our history, I see the current political environment, and I had to question, when did we decide as a nation that we the people actually means all the people? Let me demonstrate. Invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans whatsoever. Reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, convert them to his and to their use and profit. These are the words of Pope Nicholas V in a papal bull written in 1452. Now, this papal bull, along with other papal bulls written between 1452 and 1493, collectively are known as what we call the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery is essentially the church in Europe saying to the nations of Europe, wherever you go, whatever lands you find not ruled by white European Christian rulers, those people are subhuman and their lands are yours for the taking. This is literally the doctrine that let European nations go into Africa, colonize the continent, and enslave the people. They didn't believe them to be human. This is the same doctrine that let Columbus, who was lost at sea, land in this new world, which was already inhabited by millions, and claimed to have discovered it. If you think about it, you cannot discover lands already inhabited. If you don't believe me, leave your cell phones, your smartphones, your car keys, your laptops out. I'll come by and discover them for you. Clearly, this is not discovery, right? This is stealing, this is conquering, this is colonizing. The fact that to this day we have a national holiday honoring Christopher Columbus as the discoverer of America reveals the implicit racial bias of the nation, which is that indigenous peoples, people of color, are not fully human. So this makes the doctrine of discovery a systemically white supremacist doctrine that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, the challenge is what our founding fathers have done with this doctrine throughout our nation's history. So in 1763, King George drew a line down the Appalachian Mountains, and he said to the colonies that were here that they no longer had the right of discovery of the empty Indian lands west of Appalachia. This upset the colonies. They wanted access to those lands. So a few years later, they wrote a letter of protest. In their letter, they accused the king of raising the conditions of new appropriations of land. They went on in their letter to state that he has excited domestic insurrections amongst us and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. They signed their letter on July 4th, 1776. Literally 30 lines below the statement, all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence refers to natives as merciless Indian savages, making it very clear the only reason our founding fathers used this inclusive term, all men, because they had a very narrow definition of who was actually human. This, of course, makes our Declaration of Independence a systemically white supremacist document that assumes the dehumanization of indigenous peoples. Now, a few years later, our founding fathers wrote another document. They started this one with the words, "We the people of the United States." This, of course, is the preamble to the Constitution. However, if you read just a few lines later, down to Article 1, Section 2, Article 1, Section 2 is the section of the Constitution that defines who is and who is not covered by this Constitution, who is and who is not a part of this union. If you read Article 1, Section 2, the first thing you will note is it never mentions women. This is important because if you read the entire Constitution from preamble through the 27th Amendment, you will find that there are 51 gender-specific male pronouns in regards to who can run for office, who can hold office, even who is protected by this document. 51 he, him, and his, and not a single female pronoun. So we first have to note, Article 1, Section 2 never mentions women. Second, it specifically excludes natives. And third, it counts Africans as 3/5 of a person. So who's left? Well, white landowning men is who could vote. Now we have to ponder this for a moment. The reason our Constitution was written, the purpose of our Constitution is to protect the interests of white landowning men. So today we act shocked that women earn 70 cents to the dollar. This shouldn't shock us. Our Constitution is working. We act surprised that our prisons are filled with people of color. This shouldn't surprise us. Our Constitution is working. We act outraged that in 2010, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United and rules that corporations now have the same rights to political free speech as individuals. This is what opens the door for super PACs, unlimited contributions to candidates. This shouldn't surprise us. The Constitution's doing exactly what it was designed to do, is protecting the interests of white landowning men. So this makes our Constitution a systemically white supremacist and sexist document that assumes the white landowning male has the authority to decide who is and who is not human. Now, about 50 years later, we had a Supreme Court case. This is Johnson versus Macintosh. It's two men of European descent. They're litigating over a single piece of land. One of them got the land from a native tribe. The other one got the same piece of land from the government, and they wanted to know who owned it, who had the right to sell the land. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. This is the Marshall Court, and they had to decide the principle upon which land titles were based. So they ruled that the principle was that discovery gave title to the land. And then they go on to reference the Doctrine of Discovery and rule that natives who were here first but are less than human, we only have what's called the right of occupancy to the land, like a fish would occupy water or a bird would occupy the air. And Europeans have the right of discovery to the land, the fee title to the land, and therefore they are the true title holders. This, of course, creates the legal precedent for land titles, this and a few other cases between the 1820s and 1830s. And this precedent and the Doctrine of Discovery are referenced by the Supreme Court in 1954, in 1985, and most recently in 2005. Now I want to talk about this 2005 case for a moment. So in 1998, the Oneida Indian Nation purchased some of their traditional lands on the open market. They paid full price for them in the state of New York, which is where they traditionally resided, and they wanted to exercise their traditional sovereignty over these lands, which would mean they were not taxable. Now, the city of Sherrill, which is where the land resided, they wanted the tax revenue from these lands, and so they sued the Oneida Indian Nation in federal district court. The Oneida Indian Nation won that case, and the city of Sherrill appealed to the Federal Court of Appeals. The decision was upheld, and so they appealed to the Supreme Court. The case was heard in 2005, and in arguing this case, the court actually reversed the rulings of the lower courts, and in the first footnote of the case, when they're setting precedent, they reference the Doctrine of Discovery. They then go on to argue that given the Oneida's long delay in seeking judicial relief, we hold that the tribe cannot unilaterally revive its ancient sovereignty. They then go on to argue that it is impossible to rescind the cession and restore the Indians to their former rights because the lands have been open to settlement, which is white settlement, and large portions of them are now in the possession of innumerable innocent purchasers. Now, in the original 1823 Supreme Court cases, John Marshall is building his case. He actually refers to natives as savages. And he says, but the tribes of Indians inhabiting this country were fierce savages, whose occupation was war, and whose subsistence was drawn chiefly from the forests, to leave them in possession of their country, was to leave the country a wilderness. Now, in 2005, the court makes almost the same argument. It says, moreover, the properties here involved have greatly increased in value since the United sold them 200 years ago. Notably, it was not until lately that the United sought to regain ancient sovereignty over land converted from wilderness to become parts of city like Sherrill. This is the same argument John Marshall was making. It's just not using the word savages. So the Supreme Court then concludes that we now reject the unification theory of the United Indian Nation and the United States and hold that the standards of federal Indian law, which again in footnote 1 is based on the Doctrine of Discovery, and the federal equity practice preclude the tribe from rekindling the embers of sovereignty that long ago grew cold. This is quite possibly the most white supremacist Supreme Court decision written in my lifetime. And it was written and delivered by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. You see, white supremacy is a bipartisan value, and we don't know what to do with that. In 2016, Donald Trump won the US presidency by campaigning with a promise to make America great again. Not to be outdone, Hillary Clinton responded and told her supporters that America's great already. In October 2016, in the third presidential debate, she expanded and said, America is great because America is good. And Donald Trump concurred. He said, I agree with her. I agree with everything she just said. See, they both had a broad base of agreement. They both agreed our past, our history, which included the enslavement of African people and the genocide of Native peoples, and our foundations, which are based on the Doctrine of Discovery and the lie of white supremacy. They both agreed those things were great. They disagreed if we were great in 2016. Donald said no and Hillary said yes. See, we were duped. Many of us thought that the 2016 election was about racism versus anti-racism, equality versus inequality. What we were actually deciding on as a nation was, did we want Donald Trump to make America explicitly white supremacist, racist, and sexist again? Or did we want Hillary Clinton to work on our behalf to keep our white supremacy and racism implicit? And we didn't know what to do with that. It's easier to call out that candidate, to demonize that Supreme Court nominee, to oppose that particular politician, than it is to deal with our foundations. Why? Because our foundations are what prop up our land titles. See, we would rather believe that the United States of America is racist and sexist and white supremacist in spite of our foundations. But the truth is we are white supremacist, racist, and sexist as a nation because of our foundations, and we don't know what to do with that. African Americans and women will never be included as equal until we deal with the racism and sexism embedded in our foundations. Native Americans, my people, will never be included in We the People until as a nation we deal with the Doctrine of Discovery and our dehumanizing legal precedent for land titles. There's an Aboriginal leader named George Erasmus, and he says where common memory is lacking, where people do not share in the same past, there can be no real community. If you want to build community, he says, you have to start by creating a common memory. I think this quote is brilliant, and it gets to the heart of our nation's problem with race, which is we don't have a common memory. We have a white majority that remembers a history, a mythological history of discovery, expansion, exceptionalism, and opportunities. And we have communities of color that have the lived experience of stolen lands, broken treaties, slavery, Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, ethnic cleansing, genocide, Indian removal, internment camps, segregation, mass incarceration, and families separated at our borders. We have no common memory, and I think we all can agree that community on a national level is absolutely in the pits. I'm proposing that the United States of America needs a national dialogue on race, gender, and class. A conversation on par with the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that took place in South Africa, in Rwanda, and in Canada. I would call ours Truth and Conciliation, because reconciliation implies there was a previous harmony. And I think we need it sooner rather than later. My goal is 2021. Tonight, we are talking about legacy. The Iroquois did not just look 7 generations into the future. They looked 7 generations into their past. They understood that they were a part of a vast transgenerational community. And this is my challenge to you tonight. If we can learn from the wisdom of our indigenous hosts, who have been stewarding these lands for hundreds, even thousands of years, if we can acknowledge the vile racism, sexism, colonialism, and white supremacy that our founding fathers embedded deep into our foundations, and if we can pivot, we might just be able to leave a different legacy for our children's, grandchildren's, grandchildren's, grandchildren. A legacy that for the first time, we the people might actually mean all the people. Thank you very much.
So Mark Charles says a lot. Yeah. I invite you again into some somatic practice. Back into your body for just a moment before we continue. So often when we hear things that are unknown to us or challenging to us, or things that make us angry or fearful, we move forward into a mobilization embodiment. And so I invite you to just, even if it's just sensationally, whether you actually lean back or not, see if you can just lean back and down a little bit more into the floor, into the chair. Again, feeling the ground beneath your feet and the support that is holding your body. And just notice what's happening in your body right now, knowing that there is no right or wrong way for it to be. Notice where there might be constriction happening, whether it's your throat, or your solar plexus, your butt, your jaw. Where is there laxness or perhaps even numbness present in your body? And what is your body saying to you with those sensory modes of communication? It may be helpful to just continue to ground a little bit more, to be able to hold the fullness of what we've just heard. And if it's helpful to you, I invite you to take your hands in front of you and imbue them with the fullness and the ancient wisdom and the groundedness of your favorite grandmother tree. Whether that be a cedar or a sycamore, oak. And then if it feels good to do so, to place that care and wisdom, groundedness and love upon your own belly or your chest, and to receive the support. One of the things that we know about our collective trauma is that often we have not learned how to let our trauma flow in our bodies in a way that is well supported and contained. And so instead we turn it off and numb out to it, or we let it flow out and it flows out in ways that continue to do more harm. And so what can you do in this moment, whether that's just holding yourself a little bit more, taking a little bit of a deeper breath, moving back and down a little bit more into the support, to allow yourself to feel what you just heard. What feelings are present for you in what you've just heard about the foundations of our nation? Again, knowing there is no right or wrong emotion. And our work in this moment is actually to let ourselves feel those emotions and then to be well supported in them so we can move through them. As you acknowledge whatever emotions and sensations are present for you in this moment, and we gather this practice to a close, I invite you to extend gratitude to whatever it is you're feeling. Whether it be anger, or fear, or numbness, or confusion. To extend gratitude to that emotion. To say thank you for reminding me I'm human. Thank you for helping me to be human, to feel these feelings about whatever it is you've just taken. Say, I see you, anger. I see you, fear. I see you, confusion. Your... If you've had your eyes closed, I invite you to open them slowly, maybe orienting to the floor first or the edges of the room before you come back to the center. So much of our work is to learn our history, to tell the truth about our history, to make repair for our history. But in order to do that, we actually have to have feelings about it and to be able to access our humanity as it relates to that history. And that work is spiritual work. It is work for the churches. And it is essential to the work of racial conciliation, reconciliation, racial justice, whatever phrase we use. It is essential that we remain in our bodies and stay connected to our bodies as we do that work. So I want to take just a few more minutes to dig a little bit more deeply into a few details about the evolution of the Doctrine of Discovery, its connection to Presbyterianism, and then what has happened since, and see if I can do that for maybe 25 minutes, and hopefully my voice will last. So I want to just offer a few more threads in the arc of the history that Mark Charles walked us through around the evolution of the Doctrine of Discovery. It's actually been traced back to the time of the Crusades. So there were some early papal declarations that happened at the time of the Crusades, so prior to the date that he offers in the 1400s, which means that half of the lifetime of Christianity, half of this expanse of our tradition has been shaped by these ideas. For half of the existence of Christianity, we have been shaped by the idea that it was okay to invade land and murder and capture people in the name of spreading Christianity and growing the dominion of the Pope or religious authority, depending on the tradition. Just think about the idea of the influence of that notion for over a millennium in our faith tradition. In 1245, the canon lawyer Pope Innocent IV wrote a legal commentary which focused on the central legal problem which was raised by the medieval crusades and Christian warfare on non-Christian societies. And here's what he said. Under what circumstances might Christians legitimately dispossess pagan peoples of their dominium, that is, their lordship and their property? It was a justification for the Christians to lead holy wars against the infidels, or in other words, against anyone who wasn't Christian. And he first interpreted Christ's instructions to Peter to feed my sheep to be a justification for the papal jurisdiction over both Christians and infidels. So here's where we tie our theology and scripture to it, right? He understood feed my sheep means that anyone in the world belongs to Christ's flock by virtue of their creation. But not everyone belongs to the church. And so it seems that the Pope doesn't actually have jurisdiction over all people. And so we therefore can validate the invasion and the seizing of land and people to bring the sheep into the fold, to actualize the jurisdiction of the Pope over all the peoples who in fact belong to God. So in the name of feeding God's sheep and caring for all of God's flock, a seed of superiority was planted. If you do not conform to Christianity and our way of life, we will seize your land and your peoples. It is, in fact, written into the papal bull that also declared that the lands Columbus discovered, which now belonged to Spain, it states any lands that Spain might discover in the future, including the ones we call Turtle Island, belong to Spain with only just one caveat, provided they are not already in the temporal possession of any Christian owner. Now, I want to say we must be really careful not to blame only the Catholics or the Catholic tradition, because this was transplanted into Protestantism and into the British Empire for the purposes of the crusade to the New World, which is what also laid the groundwork and led to the US legal cases and the legal precedent that was set, as you heard about in the Johnson versus Macintosh case. So both Catholicism and Protestantism have carried this religious idea, right, to justify their colonial expansion around the globe. And that eventually landed upon these particular lands. And I want to trace now the through line toward the Presbyterian tradition in particular. And I want to start with a potent question that has been asked by the Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon, who's a Black Presbyterian theologian and pastor who asked our church this question 40 years ago. She said, where was the church and the Christian believers when Black men and Black women, Black boys and Black girls were being raped, sexually abused, assassinated, castrated, and physically oppressed? What kind of Christianity allowed white Christians to deny basic human rights and simple dignity to Black people? Presbyterian individuals and congregations owned enslaved peoples as well, as you might guess. In 1853, James Pennington, a black pastor, cited that he thought Presbyterians owned about 80,000 enslaved peoples. The numbers weren't good, and he actually called upon the church to do a better count. But based on those estimations, we were second only to Episcopalians in the nation to the number of slaves that Presbyterians owned. This same question about what kind of Christianity can be asked about the land theft, Indian boarding schools, and ethnic cleansing of Native American peoples. What kind of Christianity allowed these things to happen? From the General Assembly report on the Doctrine of Discovery, which a lot of this information has actually just come straight from, I'll pass it along to you all. It says the geographic expansion of the Presbyterian mission work among Native Americans often foreshadowed the movement of Euro-Americans to Native American lands. So before the white settler folks got statehood together, right, and actually kind of formalized what it meant to own and have boundaries around the land, the missionaries went first. And they worked in tandem to make that happen. Whether by presence as a US government agent to supervise the newly created Indian reservations, or as part of Grant's peace policy, or as missionaries, the church went first. And then came the statehood, right? The US government. And so I want to pull the thread of that through to Schoolcraft and Doherty. We heard from week 1 with Tom Deluge, they worked together, right? Doherty knew Schoolcraft before he even came to this particular land. And they worked together to make Michigan. Doherty built relationships with indigenous peoples, and eventually there was a deal made, which is what we now know as the Treaty of Washington. And we heard from both Tom in the first week and Mark last week, the devastation of that treaty upon the Ojibwe and the Odawa peoples, and the ways in which that treaty was immediately violated as soon as they left Washington. In 1883, the Board of Foreign Missions of the Presbyterian Church described its work among the Native peoples in this way. It said the missions were established in view of the spiritual state of the Indians. So this is like the Presbyterian Mission Agency today, right? Who thinks about our international mission to Haiti or China or pick a country, right? The Board of Foreign Missions described its work among Native peoples, the foreign peoples of the time on the frontier. They were established in view of the spiritual state of the Indians, their condition as lost sinners, and their need of Christ as their Savior led our churches to seek their salvation. It was soon perceived that as a heathen people and as speaking languages of their own, the same kind of missionary efforts were required for them, the Indians, as for the people of Africa and China. These efforts took the form of preaching, teaching in schools, training Native missionary laborers, translating portions of the scriptures, etc., very much as if they lived in Syria or Persia. I want you to notice the categories that are named and defined in that statement about the mission with the Indians by the Board of Foreign Missions. The mission is to the Native folks whose condition is as lost sinners or heathen people, just like those in Africa, China, Syria, and Persia. And it leaves the unnamed person of European Christian descent as the superior way of life, right? To become like, to be missionized toward. From the Doherty House website, there's this quote about the Board of Foreign Missions and Doherty. It says, the Board of Foreign Missions demand a deep piety, genuine personal holiness, and singleness of purpose of its missionaries. and an unswerving dedication to perfecting the spiritual, moral, and physical condition of the heathens. Peter Doherty was such a man. That's on the Doherty House website. So my friends, what kind of Christianity? What kind of Christianity does this? The Christianity I know is a Jesus who stood with the outcast and those who were trampled by society and said, my place is to be here with you in solidarity. And in fact, it's not to fix you. My job is to expose the culture and the societal structures and rituals that keep you in your place. My job is to stand in solidarity with you, expose those things, and call them defiant and wrong and oppressive and not the kingdom of God. We need a Christianity that does that. Today, yesterday. I want to leave us with a couple of examples of resistance along the way. Because though there has been a millennium of some kind of Christianity that is not doing what we believe God calls us to do, there have been people who have resisted this along the way, who are part of our spiritual lineage as well. And it's important for us to learn about them and say their names and then emulate them, right? With our own faith in the world today. So one person I want to lift up is named Samuel Austin Worcester, and he lived from 1778 to 1859. He was a Presbyterian minister who lived among the Cherokee people, and he played a crucial role in one of the most important cases regarding the tribal jurisdiction in the United States, Worcester versus Georgia, in 1832. He moved to Cherokee territory as a missionary, where he worked to translate the Bible into Cherokee, and he actually helped publish the first Indian newspaper in North America. And he opposed the removal of the Cherokees west of the Mississippi River. Georgia was wanting to take the Cherokee lands and dismantle the Cherokee government in the face of the inaction of the federal government. So this became a fight between state and federal levels. And Worcester, along with 11 other missionaries or ministers, published a resolution in protest to the Georgia law, which said that they could not live on a missionary, or they could not live on Indian territory as a missionary without a state license. And Worcester knew that obeying the law to vacate the territory would actually be surrendering the sovereignty of the Cherokee Nation to the state of Georgia. And so he stayed on the land to protect the sovereignty and try to guard against the removal of the Cherokee people. It's confusing, right? Why man on a land is protecting the sovereignty? But that's how it worked legally in this case. He stayed on the land, and he was arrested on July 7th, 1831, and quickly brought to trial and was convicted. And all the other defendants fell away from the process at some point with a plea deal, and he was the sole person to be sentenced to prison and serve 2 years of hard labor. He was eventually pardoned later by the federal government and went back to live with Cherokee people. There are many examples throughout history, and this GA report actually offers more of them, which I can share. But I also want to lift up a contemporary one, which is the indigenous effort to claim the Aboriginal lands of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe. In 2016 and 2017, you probably know, the tribe fought to resist placement of an oil pipeline under the Missouri River, which is a major source of water for Standing Rock. And the PCUSA offered support to the water protectors in numerous ways, both people showing up in person to be physically there in solidarity with their bodies on the front lines, and financial support. And in November 2016, there were representatives from the PCUSA who joined a 500-person strong gathering of interfaith clergy and lay leaders at the prayer camp. Many of my colleagues with the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship were there. So yes, we have a dark history. There's no doubt about that, right? Yes, our tradition has, in the name of our scriptures, in the name of our God, in the name of Jesus, done heinous things that we believe are actually not what our tradition and our faith teach us. And yet we have been shaped by those ideas for a millennia. And we have people in our tradition who have resisted those ideas and who have worked to teach us something different. And so there's a few questions I want to pose as we sort of round out the Doctrine of Discovery bit. And then I'll mention it before we close just a few things that have happened recently in response to dealing with this history. So the questions that I'm sitting with as I sit with you all in this series are these. Can we trace the wealth development of the Presbyterian Church in this specific region? How has this particular presbytery evolved? And what critical decisions were made that impacted Indigenous communities for the sake of growing and protecting this denomination in this particular region? And what would it look like for us to tell the truth about that history, whatever it may be? I don't know the answers to those questions. We don't have particularly egregious stories about Peter Doherty, as some have lifted up over the weeks. We don't know that he was an abuser of children in the schools, for example, right? But he was a colonizer upon the land who was good friends with Schoolcraft. And while he may have been acting out of what he thought was in the best interests of the Native community by encouraging a move to Omina, what would have happened if he had leveraged his power instead to protect their access to the lands on Old Mission, just as Reverend Worcester did? The history states that Doherty operated a school, but that school is not listed as one of the Indigenous boarding schools in the state of Michigan. What history is yet to be recovered about that school? How does all of this change how we think about land ownership? And what is our role today to reckon with this past and work toward repair? I hope that the process beyond these 4 weeks can be a conversation about some of those questions and the questions that you are raising in the course of listening to these 4 speakers. So before we go, I want to leave you with what has been done. What has been done about the Doctrine of Discovery, especially in recent history? In 2016, the Peace USA did repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. Yay! Part of that report acknowledged and repudiated what happened in the past, and it also recognized that ongoing colonialization continues today. The report states this. Additionally, through its mission work outside the United States, the Presbyterian Church has had relationships with Indigenous peoples on all continents of the world. Thus, an understanding of the origins and modern-day manifestations of the Doctrine of Discovery, including its impacts on Indigenous peoples in the United States and around the globe, is essential to meaningful recommendations of how congregations in the Peace USA can support Native Americans in their ongoing efforts for sovereignty and fundamental human rights. In other words, we have exercised the Doctrine of Discovery all over the world, right? Not just upon this land. And we must sort out how we relate to Indigenous peoples all over the globe in our ministries and our missions. The report asks every congregation to confess the complicity in the Doctrine of Discovery and to repudiate it. And the report also asked that congregations know the treaties in your land, that you work to uphold them, as if you yourself had signed them. Treaties are the highest law of the land. They are as if we made an agreement with the country of France, the nation of Canada, or Britain itself, right? It is an agreement between a foreign nation, and it is the highest law of the land. The report also says we need a clear shift of paradigm from colonial doctrines to a principled human rights framework, consistent with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This should be the foundation for future PCUSA engagement with Indigenous peoples in the United States and elsewhere. Repudiating the doctrine of discovery may, so far, be merely a recognition of bad things that happened in the past, while remaining blind to current thought and actions and their consequences. So all of that is to say, it's important to acknowledge what happened in the past and how it has shaped where we arrive today. And because we've been practicing this idea for a millennium, we are still practicing it. And it takes work for us to untangle ourselves from that behavior, that theology, that pattern of thinking, which is why it's important to learn like this, and it's important to be with us. So I'm curious, as I close here, I'm going to offer words of an Indigenous poet to close, but how many of you knew that the PCUSA had reputed the doctrine of discovery? Yeah, a couple, yeah. So we, you know, it's a good thing to say that a thing is wrong, but then if nobody knows you even said it, let alone what are you doing about it, we have some work to do, right? How many of you knew that the United States offered a formal apology to the Native American people? A few more. Okay. So that happened not that long ago either. And I'm going to close with a poem that's actually a response to that apology by the United States. And here's a brief introduction about the apology, and then I'll read the actual poem. So about the apology. On Saturday, December 19th, 2009, US President Barack Obama signed the Congressional Resolution of Apology to Native Americans. No tribal leaders or official representatives were invited to witness and receive the apology on behalf of tribal nations. President Obama never read the apology out loud, publicly, although for the record, Senator Sam Brownback 5 months later read the apology to a gathering of 5 tribal leaders, though there are more than 560 federally recognized tribes in the United States, and many more not recognized. The apology was then folded into a larger, unrelated piece of legislation called the 2010 Defense Appropriations Act. But the US has apologized, and a couple of you knew that. Layli Long Soldier is an Indigenous poet who I recommend this book. It's just incredible. It's called Whereas. And the whole set of poems is a response to what I just read, the formal apology that was not by the United States. And there's these series of whereas poems, just like a legal document, you know, whereas this happened, whereas that happened, whereas this happened. And then there's these series of whereas poems. And all of them are good. It was hard to pick. But I'm going to offer you one of those as a closing reflection. She writes, whereas I read an article in the New York Times about the federal sequestration of funds from reservation programs, the cuts in federal promises and treaties. The article details living conditions on reservations, a suicide rate 10 times higher than the rest of the country. Therein, the story of a 12-year-old girl whose mother died. She doesn't know her father. She bounces home to foster home, weary. I regard how plainly the writer imparts her repeated sexual abuse. for mental care, unavailable services. There's a clinic that doesn't have money after May. Don't get sick after May is the important message. As I read, I cry. I always cry. And here I must be clear, my crying doesn't indicate sadness. Then I read a comment posted below on the online article. I am a 14-year-old girl who recently visited the blank reservation in South Dakota with my youth group. The conditions the Native American people were living in were shocking. When I arrived home, I wrote a petition on whitehouse.gov for the US to formally apologize and pay reparations to the Native American people. The petition only stays up until July 23rd, so please sign and share. 3 exclamation points. You signing it would really mean a lot to a lot of people. Thank you. Dear 14-year-old girl, I want to write. The government has already formally apologized to the Native American people on behalf of the plural you, your youth group, your mother and father, your best friends and their families. You, as in all American citizens, you didn't know that. I know. Yet indeed, dear girl, the conditions on reservations have changed since the apology, meaning the apology has been followed by budget sequestration. In common terms, sequestration is removal, banishment, or exile. In law speak, it means seizure for safekeeping, but changed in federal budgeting to mean subject to cuts, best as I can understand it. Dear girl, I went to the Indian Health Services to fix a tooth, a complicated pain. Indian health care is guaranteed by treaty, but at the clinic, limited funds don't allow treatment beyond a filling. The solution offered? Pull it. Under pliers, masks, and clinical lights, a tooth that could have been saved was placed in my palm to hold after sequestration. Dear girl, I honor your response and action. I do. Yet the root of reparation is repair. My tooth will not grow back. The root, gone. I close with a couple of words that the former moderator, Rick Uppard Chase, has recently said to me about the work he's doing around racial justice. And they are that the only 2 kinds of mission that are appropriate for the church today are accompaniment in the midst of violent conflict and atonement through reparations. Maybe so. Amen. If there's any questions, we maybe have 2 or 3 minutes to do that. I also know this week was a little bit more of a gut punch, perhaps. Yeah. It's a great rhetorical question. Yeah, it's, the person who I'm in training with around doing anti-racism training has taught me the phrase, it's like making sense out of nonsense, right? I mean, even race itself is this made up construct. But it's real, but it's not real. And it's real because it has power in the world, but it's also not real because we made it up. And we're constantly in these cycles of making sense out of nonsense. yeah, if we were taking metrics about how successful we were, about the justification for our campaign, we would have failed, right? Yeah. They did formally repudiate it. Repudiate. They said it was wrong, right? You said this, yeah. It's both and, I think. So I would say it's something that has occurred that we are working to repair. We justified the stealing of lands and the murder of people with this idea that if they weren't European Christians, the land was there for ours to discover and call our own. And we have done that so many times that just like slavery and Jim Crow laws have evolved into mass incarceration, so has our embodiment and our practice of the doctrine of discovery. So while it may not always look or be made manifest in exactly the same way as it was in the 1800s, the seizure of indigenous lands is still happening. And I would imagine that, I don't know every instance of that. At times, the roots of the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny are linked to that seizure, and at other times they may not be made explicit. But the seizure of indigenous lands continues today. Mm-hmm. And to give you an example, I was just listening to The Daily, a podcast from the New York Times. They were doing a piece on the Congo and what's the element used in batteries? Cobalt. It was an episode about how we used to be in the Congo to mine cobalt. We kind of got out of it. China got into the Congo. Now we're interested in the Congo again because everybody wants electric cars. And there's this battle between the United States and China, these two superpowers, for who will gain access to the cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And there is no acknowledgement that there are peoples on the land who have been stewarding the land where cobalt lies that have a right to say anything about what's happening there, right? It is the competition of these vultures, eagles, pick your bird, that are coming in to seize the resource of that place and call it their own. And it looks different. It's corporations now that are saying, well, we're industrializing your nation and we're bringing money and economy and jobs, and right? But there's very little say of the actual indigenous folks about how the seizure of those resources takes place. It is past 8 o'clock, so I just want to acknowledge that. If you have to go, please do. And I'm happy to stay around for any more questions. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I know this has been a very tough session, and I anticipated that based on what Lucy told me. I would like to just close, this is very, very brief, with a reading from Walter Brueggemann on the concept of hope. Because you may leave tonight thinking there isn't any hope. And we heard from one poet. He writes, "The poet invites his people to turn from the defeated idols of old age denial to the powerful news of life, given by the righteous Savior who fashions a new world. The new world will not be old, tired Jerusalem revisited. The new world will not be a reoccurrence of old symptoms, old vicious cycles, old games people play, but a new mode of life marked by compassion, hospitality, justice, wholeness, and God will work it through us. May it be so.